Yes, today in this video we're going to talk about whether or not you should be thinking about buying a house if your horizon for owning or living in that house is a relatively short period of time, let's say 3 years or so. If you want to work with us directly, check out clevelandstreet.com. The short answer generally is that it's generally not going to be prudent, at least in my view, not going to be prudent to buy if you're going to be in that house for 3 years or less. However, ultimately it is a case-by-case situation, and what I'd like to do is just talk about the pros and cons. Basically, what are the circumstances which would lean you toward buying a house, in when you don't know if you're going to be there that long. And so let's start there. Let's just talk about that. And by the way, the reason why I generally would say no is high acquisition cost, high selling cost. The acquisition costs aren't necessarily substantial, but let's say that you're financing a purchase of a home. Most people don't have cash to buy a home, and so the financing costs there are going to be fairly significant. Let's say $5,000 to acquire the home, but then really the higher cost is the selling cost. Typically, I use a rule of thumb of 10%. Now that's very, very conservative. More realistically, you can be somewhere between 7 and 10% of selling costs, but that's substantial. Right, and so that's something that definitely needs to be factored in when you have a fairly short horizon to make that money back. So that is one of the aspects of it. The other thing is it's a risk, right? If you're buying a home, if you're anticipating that you're going to live and work in that same area for a long time and be in that home for a long time, then that risk is mitigated to the extent that you can just make your mortgage payment. You can afford to be in that house. But if you have to get in and get out in 3 years, then slight changes in the market, in the values of your home, may pose a significant risk to you in terms of being able to get out of that loan, especially if you're putting low money down. So those are why my general gut, my general answer is going to be typically you need a longer horizon than that. However, let's look at a number of different situations where that general answer wouldn't necessarily be the correct answer. Maybe the right answer is sure you should. Let's number one, if you have a company, for example, that pays all your moving costs, including selling real estate, well, that's a huge benefit. And so and that removes one of the biggest barriers to buying within a 3 year. If you're going to sell within a 3 year time frame, because that takes that 10%, that takes all of those selling costs off of your plate and puts it onto the company. And so, that would be a situation where it would tip more in favor of buying a house versus renting in a short period of time. Of course, there has to be other factors involved as well. The other thing is maybe you're in a high tax bracket. If you're in a high tax bracket versus a low tax bracket, then those tax deductions of owning real estate, financing real estate, are going to be fairly significant, and are going to weigh heavier in your break-even analysis over a 3 year period. Is it better to rent? Is it better to own? The other thing is if you are in a mode where you plan to hold real estate. Let's say that you're going to buy this as a primary residence and you expect to be moving within 3 years, moving out of this house, moving to a different state, getting promoted, whatever the circumstances are, but your goal is to acquire real estate over time and hold it. Well, in that situation, then the short-term nature of your occupancy doesn't really factor in, because you're still going to hold that real estate. You're not going to be selling it after 3 years, and so the risk associated with that are going to be mitigated or gone. The other thing is, are you in an appreciating market or a depreciating market? My general answer to most people, if they would have bought, if they would have asked me in 2019, I would say generally no, unless you have these other factors involved. But of course, we went through several years of very substantial appreciation in many markets. Now, much of that was due to COVID and other factors, but appreciation 20%, 30%, 40% in some markets. And so if you're holding property over a very short period of time, those people went big. And so my general advice would have been wrong. And of course, that points to the fact is, none of us knows the future. And so these are just generalizations based upon basic criteria, which we can expect to persist year after year after year. And then in any given year, this advice could yield the wrong result. But if you're in an appreciating market, then that would tend to, sure, go ahead and buy and hold, because again, you're trying to offset a 10% selling cost, plus let's say you're going to add another 1% for acquisition cost. So 10 or 11% selling cost, you're trying to offset that. Well, if you're in a market that's appreciating 7% per year, let's say, then over 3 years, that's up 21%, your 10% selling cost, you're still up. Plus you've got the tax deductions that went along with that along the way. So all of that would tend to say, sure, it's fine. Higher down payment versus lower down payment. The lower your down payment, the greater your risk you are. If you're in a property and you've put not a lot of money down, and then the property values go down, let's say they just go down by 10%, but you put 3% to get into the property, then you are potentially in a situation where you can't get out of that house and fully repay the mortgage with the proceeds from the sale. And of course, that's a risk. That's a risk to your credit. That's a risk to your own sense of financial propriety. And so, if you're putting if you're putting a lot of money down or a higher down payment, that tends to mitigate that risk. You're more likely or less likely to get into a situation where any sort of market depreciation or market adjustment puts you in a situation where you can't get out of that house. High rents. If you're in a market where the rents are super high, that would again tend to at least cause you to take a look at, okay, what can I buy for that? What can I buy for that same rent that I would be paying, and get the tax deductions and what. And undergirding all of this is sort of the pride of ownership, the joy of ownership. There are some people who just don't want to deal with the responsibilities of ownership, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And so you really have to be someone who takes joy and really is encouraged and enthusiastic about the idea of owning a house. That because it does come with a lot of responsibilities. But if you're in a market where the rents are relatively high and you can buy a house for about the same payment, well, that would tend to be that. And then if you got gullible friends, hey, that's also kind of in the pro column, because then they could, you can have them move in with you and cover your mortgage cost, which you can't typically do in a rent necessarily. So anyway, lots of things to consider. There are numerous situations in which my general advice wouldn't necessarily be the right advice. And so what you really want to do is look at your specific situation. So if you want to know really very specifically about your situation, obviously, as I mentioned, you can book an appointment with us, but you also might find useful information that is more specific to the various scenarios that I discussed here on our YouTube channel.